Therapy Notes is the highest rated EHR software for behavioral health professionals, and it's easy to see why. With free live customer support available 24/7 and a robust platform that's constantly expanding, Therapy Notes helps clinicians no matter where they are in their clinician journey. Try them for free for 2 months with promo code MODERN today.
You're listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide, where therapists live, breathe, and practice as human beings. To support you as a whole person and a therapist, here are your hosts, Curt Widhelm and Katie Vernoy.
Welcome back, Modern Therapists. This is the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. I'm Curt Widhelm with Katie Vernoy, and this is the podcast for therapists about the things that go on in our profession, the things that go on in our world, the ever-expanding voices that many of us attempt to have, want to have someday. And in this episode, the ways that those can backfire, the ways that those can sometimes not necessarily end up being what we are putting out into the world, but sometimes what the world thinks that we're putting out. And this episode kind of got sparked by an article that Katie and I read in the New York Times. We had our reactions enough to the point where we did a reactionary episode that once we reached out to the therapist that this article is about, we left that episode on the cutting room floor. You'll never hear that one because we did our due diligence. And we reached out to Patrick Teahan at LICSW about what the real story is and how the New York Times maybe didn't necessarily represent that every person should be cut off of their family, no matter what, anytime whatsoever. And so here to kind of talk about this process, how that's wrong. Thank you very much for joining us, Patrick.
Pleasure to be here. How are you guys?
Oh, good. I'm so glad we're having this conversation because I think Curt and I had an initial reaction to this New York Times article. And when I went to review all your stuff and watched your reaction video, I went, oh my goodness, we're like so many of the therapists in the world. And we're like, ready for action and oh my gosh, I can't believe someone's doing this. And then I looked at what you were doing. I was, ooh, this is really good work that this person's doing. And I need to know him. I need to figure out what happened here. How did this article, get painted in such a way? And what are you actually doing? And how can we share it with the world? So before we jump into all of that, I'm going to ask you the question that we ask all our folks that come on and interview with us. Who are you and what are you putting out into the world?
Who am I? I'm having like a Breakfast Club moment, like, who are you? Who are you? If anyone gets that reference. Let's see. Who am I? I am primarily thinking about this is thinking about how I got into all this work is that I'm primarily a childhood trauma survivor who got to therapy with a really great therapist in my early 20s who had a pretty highly effective group therapy model called RRP. She didn't really name it as RRP at the time. And then that was significant work that inspired me to go into social work, become a counselor, undergrad, grad school counselor. And then I sort of, like many of us, worked in jobs that were more kind of experience-based. I was working in inpatient psychiatry with veterans. And then for several years, which was a really, really difficult experience, but really a wonderful experience in terms of like the gamut of seeing how medications work, how short-term acute therapy works, how, and also just the seeing in real time a whole bunch of, sort of diagnoses as they presented themselves and understanding that and see what it looks like up front as opposed to experiencing the stigma of how those things are written on paper, how they look on paper. And essentially, after that, I went to a clinical supervisor job in community mental health. And then I really felt like private practice was always a long-term goal for me, but that's a scary leap, leaving sort of, salaried positions, which are more kind of contained in-house kind of stuff. But I really felt like going back to the therapy that I experienced in my early 20s, that I had a whole bunch of skills that were kind of dying on the vine. And it really, like, where for any therapist out there, if you find that you're doing work that your heart really isn't in it, it's really just advisable to look at that, because that was my experience where I just wasn't inspired or jazzed up or feeling like I was doing what I was kind of meant to do. So then I opened up a private practice doing RRP, my mentor's model, on my own. That was like the transition for all of us is a little bit scary, where you're taking your own insurance and doing that kind of a thing. But primarily outside of all that is, I think that where I noticed that I was able to really connect with people was more survivor to survivor, as opposed to authoritarian therapist to client. And I was able to figure out to do that in ways where it wasn't really overstepping, or they had to take care of me in terms of, you know what I mean? Like, I was, my whole thing is to be able to share some of your experience from a place of, this is what it was like before, and this is a place that you can get to after.
And part of the way that you've done that is you've built a pretty massive online following. And some people might be familiar with your YouTube channel, and that being kind of how the New York Times article starts in framing you, is about people finding you through this channel and through some of your websites and many of the things that we've encouraged our audience to do over the years, which is get your voice out there, do it in different ways. It doesn't have to be just talking with your clients as you're describing.
Mm-hmm.
And can you talk a little bit about just how you've developed that kind of background for yourself, and what ultimately attracted some of the attention here from the New York Times?
To back up a little bit, where I just threw up a video on YouTube. It was a project video that I wanted to do to kind of like embed it on my website. If people would go to my website or my Psychology Today profile or something like that, that they would get a sense about me, but also get a little bit of education on what might the ACE study consider to be childhood trauma, and then what it might actually is. The ACE study has like wonderful benefits to it. But I did this video that I animated. I spent about a month on. It was like a project that I wanted to do just so people could get a sense about me and my ideas and what we would be looking at. And then I put that up on YouTube with the idea that I needed to embed it on my website. It wasn't like a planned out, like, I'm going to go be a social media therapist and this is where I'm going to put all my energy. And that video, after a year, it got 1,000 views. And I was like, that's pretty awesome. 1,000 views over a year. Like,
sure.
You know, it wasn't wasted time. And I enjoyed the process, as laborious as it was. And then somewhere down the line, it got shared on Facebook groups or Reddit. And I would come back to the video, you know, this is a year and a half into it. And then like a year and a half into it, I'm like, oh, it's got 10,000 views. Oh, it's got 20,000 views. Like, oh, YouTube has monetized me. What does that mean? What is
wow?
Like,
on
one
I made video.
Well, yeah, and it was like sort of, and then it was like, you made 50 cents today on YouTube advertisements, and it was like, what is? It was just kind of dumb. It was just kind of this falling down the stairs kind of experience. And then I guess I just need to make more videos and keep doing this and that's where it all kind of came from. And then there's the pandemic in that, and then there's. In the middle of the pandemic, I thought my private practice would have to collapse because I wasn't seeing people in person anymore. So there's this convergence of sort of like the YouTube stuff taking off with the pandemic, and then people really wanting human connection and maybe start to work on some things. They're seeing my videos. So it was a weird experience where my private practice went beyond what I could actually handle. It went to a huge waiting list because people saw the videos and then they wanted to sort of do that. And then a couple years later came a membership. So that's where that steam that the New York Times kind of picked up on, that's how that kind of came about.
So tell us about that process where you were approached by the New York Times and then got to this article that I'm going to say painted you in a different light than one that was accurate.
It was a learning experience for me around. And hopefully this doesn't come across in the super negative or something, where it was a learning experience for me. The author of the article reached out to me to be kind of like, can you you seem to talk about the issue of going no contact. Can you speak to that a little bit? And then the more she talked to me, the more she became interested in my story. So along this line of meeting several times for this content of this interview, we met once on Zoom. We actually met up in Boston because there's a picture of me in a bar. But what was the idea behind that was like where I think it seemed like she wanted to make me more of a focus due to the story of what happened to me as a child, and then getting into therapy. And then the direction changed. For example, there's a picture of me sitting in a bar, but that's the bar that I grew up in Quincy, Massachusetts. That she does talk about my history a little bit, but what I'm getting at is that the relationship with the interviewer is sort of what was presented to me and what it seemed like, and then the final outcome of what the article ended up being are two very different things, where I kind of felt more and more comfortable to kind of talk more about. So I'm trying to say the learning experience for me was, I didn't really feel super duped. So I don't want to make it sound like it was like a manipulative kind of a thing. But the learning experience for me was I would definitely sort of, especially when mainstream media, be much more thoughtful about what I'm talking about, be much more guarded in a way from a place of sort of trust. It seemed like it would be, she was trying to create a balanced article and speaking to both sides, which I really respected and I thought would be interesting. I knew it would be inflammatory on some level because the issue is so inflammatory. So I wasn't like, this is going to be great. I was like, this is going to be a hard kind of thing going on. But it's sort of in the name of doing a both sides approach, there was a lot of sensationalized stuff in it that didn't sort of convey to what the original plan was, if I'm making sense.
Not only does Therapy Notes combine scheduling, billing, notes, and more into one easy-to-use platform, they also offer secure client and practice messaging, improved real-time eligibility, and a host of other features designed to help you thrive in your practice, regardless of whether you're a solo or group clinician.
Try them for free for 2 months with promo code MODERN today. Well, and I think the thing that I found really compelling in your response video, and we'll put that over at our show notes and mtsgpodcast.com, is that they framed things in such a way that your practice was primarily teaching people how to go no contact, and that you had almost 50% of your patients or clients who had gone no contact. And in your response video, you're like, no, it's barely a third. Like, this is a very different way to frame the same numbers. And so it was hard to see how they were even able to ethically get to how they described your practice from what I saw on your website and your response video.
Yeah. And where I was asked to be part of that article as somebody who is a practitioner who also talks about going no contact. But the outcome of it, like there's a flow chart on there, which I thought you can read into that flow chart in several ways. Do you know what I mean? Like there's some due diligence within that flow chart about whether to, and why I'm educating the public in that way around it is that there's not a lot of resources out there around it. And there's related to sort of finding a therapist who can walk you through that process, you know, in terms of like also respecting how you want to do it or educating them on it. That's where that came from.
I want to hear about the day that the article came out and you seeing some of the reactions that were happening.
Yeah, that came out early in the morning and I read it. And I, to be honest, I freaked out a little bit because I wasn't aware that my income would be discussed. I wasn't aware that a snarky reel that I did a long time ago that I haven't deleted because there's more nuance to that reel where I'm kind of being snarky and just I'm kind of making fun of an estranged parent's reactions as creators and influencers who talk about going no contact or toxic family. Is we get a lot of accusatory messages that are like, you caused this without, you know what I mean? So if your podcast is encouraging therapists to be more on social media, which I think is wonderful, like to be creative, put out your ideas, just be prepared emotionally you'll get a lot of positive feedback for people that resonated with it. And then there's just a lot of wounded people out there that want to find the reason that confirms their experience about maybe their child has gone no contact or for some other kind of thing, you know, whether that's domestic violence or something like that. Like if someone's doing domestic violence content, just be prepared that you're going to maybe hear from perpetrators.
Sure.
Who are saying, you know, there's two sides to every story, you know, so it's just, so there's within that. But my reaction, you know, I read it the first time, freaked out, read it the second time and kind of calmed down in a way that article, as sensational as it was, there was interviewing people on both sides of this kind of issue in a way that was that. I just felt like there was some unfair things to me that it would have been more fair. There was two other therapists discussed in that, and it wasn't discussed so much that they are also monetizing their skill. They are also doing webinars. They are also providing services to, which I'm not trying to demonize the other two therapists. If they're providing services to estranged parents, everyone needs a home base. Everyone needs a resource. I think both sides are accusing each other about the honesty around that, or kind of like where I would also be wondering if there could be some enabling of estranged parents to not look at themselves. And I believe that if I'm making sense here, I would also be accused of enabling people to just cut people off willy-nilly. You know, there's that kind of, so initially after the second time and then reading the comments, it was kind of a thing that was just sort of, I was actually kind of expecting something like that, not expecting exactly what it was, but I was going to be expecting some pushback or that kind of a thing. I wasn't expecting the level of how, from trying to do both sides, it wasn't really an honest both sides approach in that way.
And that's been my experience reading more and more of the New York Times articles, is that they have kind of a bee in their bonnet about how therapy is manipulative or being impacted by social media, or there's so many different articles, and we've done responses to some of them that are kind of demonizing therapists and how we operate. And so that part didn't surprise me. And yet when I first read it, I had a reaction to what I perceived your work to be. And I know that there's been subsequent articles and responses that I'm sure you've seen that have come out. And so
yeah,
what has been the backlash for you? What has been the kind of ongoing impact of this article and kind of the copycat, I think is the word you used before, the copycat articles that have come afterwards?
It's funny. The backlash has just been about, and it's really interesting to take it into the childhood trauma piece inside an abusive family or toxic family system. The backlash is kind of spelling out again about what it's like to be misunderstood by family. So in a way, do you know what I mean? We have this issue of going no contact. The article found somebody to say, here's the person doing all that wreckage. Here's the person doing all that damage.
You became the IP.
Yeah, that is, yeah, like in a way, like that is sort of, it is just like a client getting backlash from their aunt that they don't really get a lot of talk with. You know, like, you really should talk to your mom. So the article is interesting in a way that it kind of spells out what is exactly happening in families in the way, you know, it's like willful misunderstanding. Willful. So the copycat stuff is just literally just sort of the article as it was written with a couple of thoughts that are just like, this therapist is causing everything. Here it is. You know, it showed up in the Irish Times. There's a South American one. There was one, fascinating enough, one from Kashmir. And in the translation of the article, it was sort of an attack on the concept of what I was doing, or the idea of going no contact, and framing it from the idea, they kept using the word discipline, that it doesn't matter how old you are, you should have discipline. You should receive discipline from your parents. So that was like a wild cultural tangent in that way. I guess what I'm trying to say is that article, a lot of people took that article and went, see, this is what kind of therapists are doing, and this is a whole bunch of BS that people leaving their family. See, and now they have that a little bit of kind of evidence in that way. And in some ways, people aren't doing due diligence, but in other ways, the way the article was written, in some ways, I can't blame them for people having a big reaction. Like if you're a therapist in Minnesota, not really trained in childhood trauma, or having your own issues or whatever, or a therapist, doesn't matter, Minnesota, Florida, anywhere, you know, like sort of Maine, it doesn't matter. But I find that they too can go, see, this is why we try to keep the ship afloat in families all the time. So the backlash is I've done enough work in my life that I can be misunderstood. It's still uncomfortable, but I can be misunderstood. But survivors who read that article, it was hard for them. You know what I mean? It was hard for them outside of knowing me or whatever, if they don't know me or not, is that article showed up a lot on Reddit, and a lot of people were just sort of like, they were like, great, the New York Times, even people have said, my dad forwarded me this article to say, enough with your stupid bullshit in therapy. This is what you're doing. Do you follow this guy? So that's where
Wow.
it got nasty for people. And again, I'm grateful for my recovery, because this is the New York Times article is not very different than what happened to me in my teenage years about being scapegoated or whatever. And, I also understand it at the same time too. Again, I don't want to create myself as sort of the epicenter of this thing, but that's the backlash. The positives is we got kind of an overwhelming response of therapists who wanted to train in RRP from that article. There was a lot more interest in the channel. There was a lot more interest in, you know what I mean? So I think that other people read it too and found the work in some way, or found some relief in some way. And maybe they knew me prior, or maybe they didn't, but so it was really a mixed reaction.
Our reaction in the episode on our cutting room floor was really around kind of the idea that
Appreciate it.
just being transparent, which I think is our style, is our episode had really come from the idea that we shouldn't go into therapy with, this is the outcome that we are going to arrive at, that our kind of initial reaction was around, this might be one of the outcomes that people arrive at in working through family systems issues. And I guess giving this the pivot that we understand that that's actually how you work, and want to talk about what is RRP and being able to actually focus on what it is that you do rather than what the media says that you do.
In that article, the media it's made it sound like I was just sort of selling directions on how to go no contact without taking in anybody's subjective experience or types of family, which is not the heart of my work. RRP was developed by my mentor, Amanda Curtin. It is a group psychotherapy model.
What do the initials stand for?
The relationship recovery process.
Okay.
So the relationship to others and the relationship to self. Because with childhood trauma is about disconnection and lack of intimacy and lack of connection. So RRP has two goals. The first goal is finishing business with our family system of origin, where we're really looking at stuff like the internalized parent, self-hate, shame, deciding about whether our parents were right about us or not. And really, it's really for people who grew up in families where they were really sort of unsafe. This is, it's where other people can come from good enough families. I think everyone is going to have stuff in their family system but really, this is really for people who are really experience emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. Finishing business with our parents is really looking at all the belief systems, all the situations. So it's like an umbrella term for really looking at what happened to us and finding our voice and empowerment and truth telling about what happened in a safe environment, which is the group, which is usually of around 6 to 8 people, ideally 8, of adults over the age of 18. The other goal is reclaiming intimacy in the way that childhood trauma survivors are often set up to really struggle with intimacy in terms of trust, intimacy with self, like being dissociative. We really use the vehicle of inner child work to help people connect with themselves more. They're reparenting their inner child, also while they're doing intimacy and conflict work with other group members over time. So those are really the two goals, finishing business and also reclaiming intimacy. So it's a pretty, really advanced interpersonal group, almost like sort of Yalom in a way of over time. But there's a lot of lead up to that. Initially these RRP groups Amanda did a 3 to 3.5 year program, which is what I did. And then in my own private practice, I introduced a 6-month model to give people an introduction to the work without 3 years is a big commitment. When I was 20 years old and I was really in bad shape, I was so out there. I was like, yeah, sign me up, whatever. I got nothing going on. So I came up with a 6-month model that if people wanted to continue in longer term work, should that work be available to them, that they can do that and not have to. It's like kind of they can dip their feet in and get a lot out of a 6-month group instead of going a longer term route. But a lot of people want to continue in that way because they get a lot of relief from the equalization of sitting in a room. Sitting now, it's a Zoom room, but sitting in a room with someone who had a violently mentally ill mom and an unprotective dad, and really the great kind of equalizer in that way. So, but the intimacy work, there's a lot of lead into it. It's not like the 7th session they're doing like conflict resolution. It's really more and more safety over time.
So there's a lot of individual work to get yourself, I'm thinking of, the client, the group member, into a place where they can more confidently approach relationships and also have a stronger relationship with themselves.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like long term? I know that I think you had said, maybe 30% end up going no contact. Other folks, I'm assuming, are having some reparative conversations with their families. What does that look like when people go back to their families of origin and make the decisions around how they're going to engage with their families of origin?
I think I know what you mean. Through the course of the group, people are really, a lot of RRP, the beginning of it especially, is about making your childhood more real. So we're really looking at what a healthy family system is like versus an unhealthy family system, processing things. And let's just say, no contact is a very long process to get there. So usually, let's just say someone is in a 3-year group, probably like around 2 to 2.5 years, they may have kept trying to go have a visit with their mom and dad or a connection with their brother or something come up. But what I'm trying to say is that the issues in the families becomes less tolerable to the person as they become more real about the abuse that came from family. And what it looks like for those, 30% is like a good sort of, not everyone needs to do it. A lot of people sometimes their parents have kind of mellowed out, and the person can go back into the fold of the family system without getting massively triggered. Or a lot of for those who go no contact, it is usually about continued abuse that is going on while they're in work, which was in the case of me, that's what it was like for me, of continued sort of fighting about what happened, or that the parent is still emotionally manipulative or sexually off or that kind of stuff. So usually it's sort of around the person is really kind of waking up to how much they have very little to work with. And they will get support from the group and from myself if they choose to go do that. You know what I mean? If someone would, like, it's usually that the person has been talking about these issues for a long time, and they get to a place where the group starts to talk about, have you considered this? I hate seeing you in this place when you go back to them or on those visits. And the person might have seen other people kind of benefit from going no contact. But we talk about it in a way where there's really no pressure. If they want to know how it's done, they are welcome to get some guidance from me kind of around it. But if I'm seeing a group member really struggle in that way, I might bring it up and say, you have all the choice in the world, but I think you would benefit from some distance. And in those cases, it's really because the person gets massively triggered every time they go back into the family system, and they're really struggling within their work to get their work done around it. It's a little bit like the inner child still believes that dad is right about them. So they go and they try to go do something there, and it kind of falls apart. So in those moments when it comes up, I do suggest it, but I don't push it. Do you know what I mean? It's just something, it's almost like when we have a client who's struggling with alcohol abuse. Do you know what I mean? We're not going to go super hardcore AA on them. And, the first time we hear it and be like, you're a drunk and you're a mess and you need to get this together, and I'm not going to see you anymore unless you do this. Do you know what I mean? It's like, there's just sort of letting the person It's almost like good parenting with a teenager, of letting the teenager have their own process with it until there comes a point where there might be some more directive help might be needed. But even still, that directive help really looks like, I think you could consider this, but you have to do what's right for you. It doesn't really work for everybody, you know?
For the clients who do decide to go no contact, I recognize that you're saying that this is a very long process, but it's not as simple as just ghosting their family. There's something else that goes on with this. Can you speak a
Yeah.
little bit to what some of those steps might look like?
Well, I think it depends on the horrific nature of the family, where sometimes, and again, it's so individualized. If it's super horrific, where it's just off the rails, I think ghosting might be something that somebody need to do. I personally just don't like ghosting in our culture in a way that there's just not a lot of closure for the other person. That's just my own personal feeling about it. Whether that's, I know I'm probably going on a tangent here, but like,
No, I think this is a great tangent because I can see therapists trying to help their clients with this and their clients
yeah,
just immediately responding with something like, well, they don't deserve closure. They were abusive to me for years. This is, taking
yeah,
care of me.
right. It's a tricky thing. It is a tricky thing that depends on. I think about a client who recently, in one of my last groups, they struggled with it for a long time, and they kept getting re-traumatized by messages that they would get from a parent. It wasn't like, I'm concerned for you. It's like, why haven't you done this thing yet, or something like that. And this is after a really horrific, violent childhood. They were at a point where they had been setting boundaries about those connections and communications for years. And they got to a point where they just kind of had to say, yeah, we're not coming together on anything on this. I'm going to take a break. And you've heard me in the past. It's the same stuff. You know what I mean? That is that's not ghosting. Like the other part of it is like when we've set boundaries with someone several times, and I think we start setting boundaries with a toxic parent in childhood. Like, mommy, do you have to get so mean when I make a mistake? Really early stuff. Those are those conversations that lead up to decades going into no contact. So I think by the time the person is at that place where they might do it, which is the hardest thing that they will ever do in their life. So the article also makes it really kind of flippant, the way that it's just kind of talked about, like as if I'm talking about how to assemble an IKEA dresser. You know what I mean? Like, yeah,
Which isn't easy
you
either.
just send a letter and you do the thing, and just do your best. I don't know. So about the ghosting is, thinking about it, and it's not clear in the article, but I encourage people to make a statement that is not super long, because I think the danger there is that, let's just say that the client that I mentioned, and that's a very similar conundrum that a client finds themselves in. I don't think it's good to write a 3 or 4 page letter of stuff that you've already said for years. I think maybe a shorter statement that is, the parameters around it. What, is there a time period around it? That kind of a thing. But a lot of the copycat articles from the New York Times made it seem like, make a letter, don't make a letter, just whatever you do, there's a strict adherence to just being no. I don't know where that came from. I was almost make it sound like I was saying, if you're going no contact, you can never contact them again and it's over. It's just like, in my own family, I've gone no contact from my surviving parent several times, and trying to do that with them. And sometimes those times were good, and sometimes the behaviors just kind of came back. So, but I don't know if I'm answering your question. I don't think that ghosting is good. I think that estranged parents need some kind of notice, but we're also dealing with an estranged parent who is most likely emotionally immature. Like, in other words, if someone wrote out a 1-page letter explaining the things, we're not going to have an emotionally immature parent like, oh, I got it. They're going to be defensive. They're going to pick apart that letter. It's indicative of the article as well, as picking and choosing, cherry picking issues to kind of go over, if that makes sense. I don't know if that answers your question.
In the way that I'm understanding this, the work that you're doing is first off, you're educating and you're letting people know what some of these dynamics are that are unhealthy, the things that can impact adults when their childhoods have been abusive or violent or toxic in some way.
Yeah.
And helping individuals to get to the place where they're improving their own health and their mental health in a way that these dynamics are no longer tolerable for them. And what that does is that upsets the system. And so then it sounds like once the system is upset, that if they're going back, they're making these efforts with family. And I think probably there's been some of these things that most therapists end up doing. They learn, oh my gosh, my family wasn't perfect. They go back and they may make some of these attempts or provide, psychoeducation on what's right. And some families will do the work, right? The parents will learn,
Right.
there'll be different conversations, there'll be dynamics that switch because now whether it's the IP or not, the person has come back into the system in a different way. And that may be beautiful work. And it sounds like for some of your clients, that's what happens. But for the folks that come back and they keep hitting the same system, they've been re-identified as the problem because they're now the rabble rouser. Then it becomes this thing where it may not be healthy for them to stay in that environment. And I like that you said distance versus no contact as kind of the initial piece is stepping back. It might be limited contact. It could be no contact for a period of time. But this is not a necessarily long-term strategy for every single client. It might be required as a long-term strategy for some folks. But you're describing a lot of nuance and there's a lot of messiness in all of this. And there's a lot of work that happens that's so different than, putting the IKEA cabinet together of this is how you go no contact. And so I really appreciate that work. Are there other pieces of the work that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Yeah. And I like what you just said there. Just to clarify, it's super rare for my clients and clients that are coming to this stuff with childhood trauma. The majority have parents and families that are not working on themselves. So whether it's like we connect with an ex again, or we're in a partnership or something like that, if one person is working on themselves, the other person is kind of left behind. So for those that go no contact, say for 2 or 3 years to work on themselves, 6 months or whatever, when they come back into their family system, the family might know a little bit more of boundaries that are along, well, don't set her off again. But that's not really honest learning about how you got there or how the family really is. So, but that can still be a positive, that the family is a little bit, they don't have to understand, but they may have to have some boundaries, which might make a Thanksgiving dinner or a connection or a weekend with them tolerable, if not a little bit enjoyable. But there's just still such elephants in the room, which is what the client is going to need sort of help with accepting. So, but it does happen. Sometimes it's super rare that a parent sort of looks at themselves or wants to go to family therapy. I see a lot of estranged parents going, well, let's go to family therapy. And then when they get to family therapy, it's kind of like, see, the therapist is right. That you're wrong, like you're wrong, I'm right kind of stuff, and there's not a lot of insight in that way. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. But your question was what other work comes with RRP?
Well, just anything else to give us a fuller picture before we wrap up, because I know that we've been still kind of focusing a little bit on the no contact, and I know that there's other pieces of the work that you wanted to make sure that you shared. So I wanted to give that space.
Right. The other pieces of the work are, I do want to sort of say that clients, lastly on no contact, clients who do go no contact or set boundaries or withdraw in some way, for those that go no contact and who really are unsafe with their family, they do a lot better in terms of getting to the work that they need to kind of get to. Because it's sometimes continued engagement with abusers, it's not like it's really not unlike domestic violence in a way that you really kind of can't get to a place of working on yourself if you're constantly dealing with the thing. But the other work around RRP is what I really love about RRP is people get a sense of really developing community for the first time, community of their peers. You know what I mean? Like when you're a childhood trauma survivor, when you're sitting in a cube at like a bank or one of your jobs or something like that, and you come from a very dysfunctional or alcoholic or abusive family system, and the person in your next cube is having a lovely conversation with their mom, you definitely feel like you're the other in society or another in some way. So when they get to these groups, is the person, the exact scenario that I just talked about, each group member would totally understand each other just in an unspoken way about what it's like to be that person in the cube and having to live your life and kind of maybe hiding this stuff or trying to maybe find a partner and assimilate into a better family. It's a very lonely place to be. So what I really love about the work is the community. It's hard work. It's a lot of like elective surgery in a way, because you're really going into and really talking about some hard things. You don't have to do that 100% up front. But I find that when people join either a 6-month group or long-term group, the first couple months of the psychoeducation piece around it is people do a little bit more poorly before they get better, because they're starting to really feel it. They're really starting to feel their childhood. We're starting to make the unconscious conscious in that way. I've been in love with the work for a really long time. And what I really love about it is, for years I've known that it's really, really worked. It worked for me, but for the past 2 years we've been doing research and having clients fill out a PCL-5 and some other measures like self-compassion, and we're doing a research project of kind of really crunching empirical numbers to see how clinically effective it is. And our findings, especially around the PCL-5, is incredibly effective, which we're really, really happy about, to have that be kind of like known to us, and working on sort of publishing our first paper within the next sort of 6 months on those findings and how we did it. So we're trying to launch a therapy, which is like a really interesting concept. We're trying to launch, how did DBT become a thing? How did CBT become a thing? It's kind of like a wild thing. And I didn't think I would love the research as much as I really like it, because it's just so fascinating about what we're kind of finding, and how even just measures compared to other measures, how that can have its own kind of outcome, like where initially I had wanted a measure to measure authenticity in the 6-month group. And I was really super jazzed about that, but it's where there wasn't a lot of change in terms of changes in authenticity, and then realize after that comes with the later work, that comes with the longer work. So lots of good things kind of going on about it.
Where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
The internet. You can find all kinds of stuff. Some stuff you don't want to find. My website, patrickteahantherapy.com, YouTube channel, just Google, I think a good introduction was kind of the initial video that I did. It's a video called Was I Abused? And that is really kind of spelling out, there's an assessment I did in that video comparing it to the ACE study, where the ACE study leaves out a lot of the population, like unless you're in horrific shape according to the ACE study. And again, I'm not criticizing the ACE study. I'm just like those. And I know that they have a longer assessment now. And walking through that assessment, or walking through the toxic family test on my website, which is also on step to be in a publication sometime in the next year. We're kind of in a review phase with it. That's really where I would kind of start, is to kind of like see about where it's not so much about the score is important in both of those assessments, but the nature of the questions is something that I really want people to kind of think about.
And we will include links to those in our show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com. Follow us on our social media, join our Facebook group, the Modern Therapist Group, in order to continue on with this conversation. And until next time, I'm Curt Woodhelm with Katie Bernoy and Patrick Teahan.
Thanks again to our partner, Therapy Notes, the #1 trusted EHR among mental health professionals. Don't forget to use promo code MODERN and try them out for 2 months free today.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. Learn more about who we are and what we do at mtsgpodcast.com. You can also join us on Facebook and Twitter. And please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes.